we've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Mike Drews, is really looking forward to sharing his valuable insights and expertise on both change management and risk management, and specifically how you can integrate these two components in order to assess, implement, and validate change in the context of risk. Before we get too deep in today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few housekeeping items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Mike has been kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of them as time permits. We will also be sharing the full recording and slides with all registrants after the webinar, so no worries, keep an eye out in your inbox. That'll be to you sometime later today. I'd like to go ahead and share a few words about Greenlight Guru real quick and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission to many of you on today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenter, Mike Drews, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies across the globe are moving away from paper-based general purpose quality management system and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. All right, so now on to the bulk of the presentation today. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter and distinguished partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drews. Mike Drews is the president of Vascular Sciences, a consultancy and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation preparation, and defense. Dr. Drews is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experiences in his teachings from the ongoing work he does with FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and government agencies all across the globe. He's a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. If you are familiar with the Greenlight Guru Medical Device podcast, you'll recognize his voice right away. He's a longtime and frequent guest on the show and a close friend of mine that I've gotten to know over the years. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Mike Drews.
And Mike, before you chime in, I wanted to let you know that the world has been restored on my end. So I don't know if you broke the internet or I broke the internet, but I'm back. So thank you, Nick, for calling an audible and filling in. And thank you, folks, for being patient as we worked out some of the technological kinks. But anyway, Mike, take it away.
Well, thank you, John, and also thank you to Nick for stepping in at the last moment, and thank you to everyone in the audience for bearing with us when we were dealing with our technical details. And John, I don't think it was me that broke the internet this time because I didn't do anything. I think it must have been you.
Fair enough.
Anyway, so I want to thank all of my friends at Greenlight.Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. And obviously, I want to thank everyone in the audience, not just those of you in the audience who are listening right now live, but those of you that may be listening in the recorded version of the future. The topic of today's webinar is change management and risk management. How do we connect the dots and what happens if we don't? My name is Dr. Michael Drews, but you can just refer to me as Mike. Nick shared with you my introduction, so I'm not going to go over that. The only thing that I wanted to remind our audience of, for those of you that don't know me, is I do put out a lot of columns and articles and podcasts and webinars on a variety of topics in a variety of venues, including Greenlight. So here's a list of those. Feel free to check them out as you're interested in. But let's begin, John, with some polling questions before we get into the subject matter of today's webinar. And here's the first one. These are just a few quick yes or no questions. So right. The first one is, do you have a change management and risk management systems currently in place? Please respond yes or no to that question. Do you have change management and risk management systems currently in place? I think, John, you and I probably can guess what the answer is, but let's see what our audience says.
Yeah, and folks, with this and the next few questions, they're all yes, no. So be on the spot. We want to get through these pretty quickly so we can get to the bulk of the presentation. All right. Results on this one, Mike, 89% yes, 11% no.
Okay, that's what I figured. I actually thought it might even be higher than that, John, but 90% is pretty good. The next question is, do you think those systems work? Yes or no? And I'm tempted to ask John, but I won't in a webinar. How do you know if they work? If the answer to that question is yes. So if you can please respond. And for those in the audience that have, know me or listened to me before, please don't make the assumption that just because you meet the regulatory requirements, that those systems necessarily work. I think that's a dangerous assumption to make, because, John, you and I both have seen companies where their systems meet the regulatory requirements and yet they don't work. So I'm just curious.
For sure.
How many in our audience think that the systems that they do have, 90% of them said that they have those systems. How many of them think that they work?
58% said yes, 42% said no.
Interesting. So roughly about 40% of our audience says that they have systems in place, but for whatever reasons, they don't seem to work. I would love to explore that further, maybe in the Q&A section. But what's the point of having systems in place if they don't work? Okay, moving on to the next question, and this gets us into the subject matter of today's webinar. Are those systems, specifically the change management and risk management systems, are they somehow linked together? Do they talk to one another in one fashion or another? Let's see what our audience thinks about that, John. Are those systems linked together in some way?
All right, results are coming in quick. If only real voting could happen this fast, but that's a whole different topic and we won't go there. So
be careful, John. We might not go there.
Yeah, touche. All right, so share those results. 54% yes, 46% no.
Okay, so again, interesting. Almost half of our audience is saying that those systems are not linked together, and perhaps that's why those folks are in our audience today. The last two questions: does changing a medical device necessarily imply that there's a change in risk? Does changing a medical device, it could be in terms of design, labeling, manufacturing methods, a variety of different changes we'll talk about later. Does changing a device necessarily imply a change in risk? Yes or no? What does our audience think, John?
All right. Let's share those results. So 52% said yes, 48 said no.
So once again, we're split almost 50-50. Like you, John, I'm tempted to make a political metaphor comparison, but
yeah, let's don't do it. Not today.
And then finally, the last and perhaps my favorite question is: does not changing your medical device necessarily imply that you don't have a change in risk? Or put another way, can you have a change in the risk of your product without making any change to your device whatsoever? Can you have a change in the risk of your device without changing your device in any way? What does our audience think, John? That one, John. I don't think that most of them probably have thought of that kind of a question before.
So the results are a little bit slower, so this might be a little bit more thought-provoking. So we'll give it just a few more seconds.
Well, I'm glad I can get people to think, John. It is sort of a twist on an interesting question. We'll talk about it a little bit later.
All right, so 45% said yes, and 55% say no.
Okay, interesting. So it's the 55% that say no that I think are going to maybe learn something a little bit later in this webinar. So anyway, thanks to everybody who participated to get the brain juices flowing a little bit today, and also gives me a better idea of where we're starting from. So in terms of today's agenda, what I want to try to cover in as much as I can in the limited time that we have is, how do we integrate, that is, how do we connect the dots, if you will, change management with risk management? How do we assess, implement, and validate the the changes that we make in context of risk, which changes necessitate a risk evaluation and which do not. What does change management and risk management, how does change management and risk management vary pre-market versus post-market? What if your device is capable of changing or evolving by itself, John, if you're working, as some people are now, in the area of artificial intelligence? I'll talk about that towards the end of today's webinar. And finally, what are the consequences of not integrating or connecting the dots between change management and risk management? So those are some of the high points, the questions that I'm going to try to hit during the time that we have together. And as always, I want to share with you as many tips and tricks as I can during the time that we have together. And then I'll wrap this up with a few final thoughts and recommendations, and then we'll send you all on your way. So before we get into the details of this topic, specifically trying to connect the dots between change management and risk management, why this topic? This was a topic that was proposed to me as a webinar, and my first response was, why this topic? Because as some in the audience may know, I've done many webinars with Greenlight in the past. Here's one that I did back in 2017 on change management. Here's another one that I did back in 2017 on risk. And I'm proud to say, John, that in the 3 or 4 years since doing these webinars, these remain two of the most popular webinars, as I understand it, as I'm told, within the Greenlight Guru family of webinars. So I thought, why would I, simply combine them? Well, when I thought about it a little bit more, I thought, gee, this is an interesting topic, because when we combine them, the benefit is actually greater than the sum of the parts. So this is sort of a synergistic relationship, if you will. In other words, obviously, change management is very important. Obviously, risk management is very important. However, when you think about it, and as we'll talk about it through today's webinar, the sum of the two put together is equally important, probably more important than the individual parts. And I'll show you, we'll talk more about this, and I'll share with you some examples as we continue on. So that's kind of why we're talking about this topic. It is not simply a rehash of what I've talked about in the past. And by the way, for those of you that have not watched these two webinars, I highly recommend it, not because they're from me, I mean, obviously I'm inherently biased, but because they are such important topics. And as we'll talk about in a moment, when it comes to change management, as some of you may know, the single biggest reason why companies get either 483 observations or in many cases warning letters is because of change management or the lack thereof. And similarly on the risk side, as many in our audience probably know, I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in a few different areas, one of them being risk. And it's amazing to me how myopic of a view that so many people have of risk. It's a lot more complicated than a lot of people think. Speaking of risk, what I did is I pulled out just one or two of what I thought were the most important slides of my risk webinar that I just referred to for two reasons. First of all, to give a quick recap for those of you that did watch that webinar, because it was a while ago, but also for the benefit of those in the audience who are newer, who maybe have not watched that webinar or seen some of my other information I put out on risk. For a long time as a professional biomedical engineer, I have been very, very troubled with our approach as an industry to risk. And I have a huge problem with a lot of the quote unquote standard approaches to risk, including the ISO standard for risk. I think, quite frankly, they're just woefully inadequate, woefully inadequate. Just because something is the industry standard, just because most people follow it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. So several years ago, I came up with my 3-bucket approach to risk, as I like to call it. And I just want to take you through that very, very quickly. Again, as a recap for those that are familiar, and then as a bit of something new for those that are not. So we're going to focus on these different connotations of risk, the big 3, as I like to call it, and then I'll give you one for bonus. So my inspiration for this 3-bucket approach came from the old TV show from decades ago, the Bozo Circus. Some of you may remember the grand prize game. So bucket number 1 is what I call the probability of direct harm. The probability of direct harm. This is the most obvious form of risk. And this is the one that most people think of first. What we mean here is the harm that could potentially result directly from our medical device, usually to the patient, sometimes to the caregiver. So as I said, this is the most obvious form of risk. And by the way, this is the only form of risk that is addressed in the most companies' risk management plans, and is the only form of risk that's addressed in the design controls. It's one of the reasons why I think that the ISO and the design controls and others are so limiting, because they take this myopic view of risk. But there are other forms of risk that are just as important, sometimes even more important. And again, I'm going through this very quickly. For those that are not familiar with this approach, I would refer you to the webinar that I just described a few minutes ago. Bucket number 2 is what I call the probability of harm of not using what FDA calls alternative practices and procedures. We're using different words, but we mean exactly the same thing. Probability of harm of not using means what is the possibility of harm to the patient if they don't use our medical device. This is one of the important differences between the 510K and de novo universe versus the PMA universe. In the PMA universe, it is required to consider the risks of what I call the probability of harm of not using, or what FDA calls alternative practices and procedures. Again, it doesn't make any difference. We're using different words, but we mean the same thing. It's not required in the 510K or the de novo world, although when I go to the FDA, and I'm there very, very frequently, I like to demonstrate to them that I know what I'm doing, and that regardless of if I'm developing a Band-Aid or an artificial heart, my process is exactly the same. So even though for a class 2 device, a 510K or de novo, I am not required to consider alternative practices and procedures or the probability of harm of not using, I still put it in there anyway, even though it's not required. And finally, we get to bucket number 3, the probability of providing the wrong information. This is endemic in all devices that are conveying what I call actionable intelligence. For example, diagnostic devices. Could be a telemetry monitor like an EKG monitor. It could be an in vitro diagnostic. It could be an imaging system like an X-ray or ultrasound or CT or something. It doesn't matter. It's endemic in all devices that are conveying information. For example, false positives and false negatives. So what's the probability if we take a IVD for cancer, for example? What's the probability of telling the patient that they have cancer when in fact they do not? That would be a false positive. Alternatively, what's the probability of telling the patient that they do not have cancer when in fact they do? That would be a false negative, I think, or if I got those backwards, I apologize. But anyway, you get the idea. So those are my 3 buckets: the probability of harm, direct harm, the probability of harm of not using, and the probability of providing the wrong information. In addition to that, there's my bonus bucket, what I call regulatory risk. Regulatory risk has a couple of different connotations. One connotation is the probability of getting smacked. In other words, what if you say something about your device, or in our case, we change something about our device, and FDA comes knocking on our door and says, hey, you've changed your device. We don't remember you ever coming and telling us about it and talking to us about it. What the heck is going on? That's one connotation of regulatory risk. The second connotation of regulatory risk is what is the probability that I am not successful when I go to the FDA selling my regulatory strategy? Every regulatory strategy has a certain degree of regulatory risk. You cannot avoid it. You can try to minimize it, but you can't avoid it. And I always talk about regulatory risk with all of my customers. Of course, I never talk about regulatory risk with the FDA because that's not their business. But before going to the FDA, I always talk about the regulatory risk because in the regulatory world, there's nothing that's black and white. There's an infinite number of shades of gray. There's different options that we can have. We can go, with different pathways, a 510K versus a de novo versus a PMA and so on. And there are advantages and disadvantages. Each and every one of them has a certain regulatory risk associated with it. Bottom line, there's lots of forms of risk, more than what I'm talking about here. But this is my 3-bucket approach to risk. So now as we get into the topic of change management, and then we're going to add the 2 together, risk and change together. Imagine this not so hypothetical scenario. FDA comes knocking on your door one day they say that you changed your medical device, but you didn't tell them, and they say, hey, what the heck is going on here, right? So what are the consequences of that decision? Well, there are a lot of different consequences. First of all, on the regulatory or quality side, there are consequences, but also, as some in our audience have heard me talk about, there are product liability consequences as well. And that's why change management is so important, because one of the ways that companies get in trouble sometimes, actually oftentimes, when it comes to change management, is FDA will come into a manufacturing inspection, for example, and they'll notice that you as a manufacturer have made some kind of a change. I'll give you examples later, but some kind of a change to your device without telling the FDA. You probably have handled that via what we call a letter to file, right? So is the justification that you put in your letter to file sufficient? Is it strong enough to defend your position of doing this as a letter to file, or should you have notified the FDA in terms of either a special 510K or a PMA supplement, depending on how your device is on the market? Once again, in this webinar today, I don't have time to get into the details of change management by itself in a lot of detail, but I just want to remind you, the single biggest reason why companies get in trouble on manufacturing inspections, 483 observations, warning letters, and so on, is because of change management or the lack thereof. It's a very unfortunate circumstance. And by the way, most of those problems are totally avoidable. So I share a lot of those tips in the other webinar. So if you want to make a change to your existing device, in other words, a device that's already on the market, how do you decide how to handle that change internally? In other words, do you keep this internal to you via a letter to file, or do you notify the FDA either with a special 510K or perhaps a PMA supplement? Well, at a very, very high level, the questions to ask are, can the proposed changes affect the safety, efficacy, performance of this product? In other words, as soon as we change the device, in essence, we now have created a new device. And so are those changes significant enough to potentially change the safety, efficacy, performance? And then, as I said earlier, how do you know? Because simply answering the question, no, it does not affect safety, efficacy, ... In my opinion, that's not enough. How do you know? How do you defend your answer? And bottom line, when it comes to the manufacturer, you need to have some process in place with specific criteria, and you need to validate it. Now, as I'm sure John and most other people in our audience will tell us, one of the quote-unquote required components of a quality management system is to have a change management section in there. But yet again, as I said earlier at the beginning of the webinar, just because the QMS, in this particular case, the change management system, meets the regulatory requirements, does not mean that it works. Why? Because if the QMS, specifically the change management portion of your QMS, worked, how do we explain the fact that, once again, I'll say it for emphasis, the single biggest reason that companies get in trouble is because of change management or the lack thereof? To me, as my wife would be the first one to point out, I'm not always the brightest bulb on the tree, but I have no idea how we can connect those dots. If on one hand we say we have a change management system and it works, and on the other hand we say, but I've got a stack of 483s and maybe some warning letters that demonstrates the opposite. So I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. And finally, since the topic today is integrating change management and risk, if we change our medical device, what does that do to the risk? This is why I asked the question earlier. One of the questions was, is your change management system and your risk management system, are they linked together in some way? In many companies, and we can have a discussion about this at the end, but at least in my experience, many companies, those systems, change management and risk, exist in isolation. In other words, they exist independent of one another. And I think, I don't remember the specific statistics from our poll earlier, but roughly about half of our audience said that those two systems are not linked together in some way. And that's problematic, because if we change a device and we don't reassess risk, I mean, to me, that's common sense. That's a no-brainer. It's unfortunate that we seem to need regulation to tell people to do that, when to me, it's just basic engineering. It's just common sense. We should do that. So let's dig into this, pardon me, a little bit further and talk about what's the relationship between change management and risk management. Well, the metaphor that I like to use, everybody is familiar with copy and paste, but it's not a copy and paste relationship. What a lot of people are not familiar with is there's different versions of copy and paste that we can use. And one of the versions that we can use that I use a lot, but I don't see a lot of other people use, is what's called copy and paste link. Now, you am using, Microsoft's example here as a metaphor to illustrate. If you're not familiar with this, you can Google copy and paste link. I'm sure you'll come up with a litany of YouTube videos that talks about how you do it in Microsoft Word or Excel or something. But what I mean by it here is there should be a dynamic relationship between change management and risk management. The essence of copy and paste link, when you do a regular copy and paste from one portion of a Word document to another, it's a one-time event. In other words, you change that information, you copy that information into the second place, but if you change the information from where it is, it's not automatically changed. It's not automatically updated in where you pasted it to. On the other hand, if you use copy and paste links, a very interesting feature within, Microsoft Office, you create a link between those two things, which basically means you copy that information, but if you change the information, if you add a word or delete a word where the information is copied from, it will automatically be added or deleted where the information is copied to. That's the concept, the metaphor of copy and paste link. And that's the way, in my opinion, your entire QMS, not just change management and risk management, but that's the way that the system is supposed to work. We should have dynamic links so that if we change one thing, if we change our medical device, for example, it automatically triggers a risk reevaluation, and we'll talk about there. So this is a philosophy I think that is very important to understand. And as I said, it's not limited to just change and risk management. It should be applied to all of your different systems, complaint handling, CAPAs, and so on and so on. Is this required? Should it be required? Well, I like to think of it as common sense. Let's see if it's actually required. One of my favorite sections of the FDA's website is this, what I call the preamble to the quality system or regulation, or the QSR. And good regulation is neither specific nor rigid, and in my opinion, nor should it be. I just want to share with you a couple of highlights, and this is FDA's words, not mine. Regulation must apply to so many different types of devices. The regulation does not prescribe in detail how a manufacturer must produce a specific device. Rather, the regulation provides the framework that all manufacturers must follow by requiring that manufacturers develop and follow procedures and fill in the details that are appropriate to a given device. Further, FDA goes on to say that manufacturers should use good judgment. I love that phrase. Good judgment when developing their quality systems and applying those sections of the QSR that are applicable. Some are going to be applicable, others are not going to be, to their specific products and their specific operations. The manufacturer should establish requirements for each type or each family of device that will result in devices that are safe and effective, whatever that means. And that the responsibility of meeting those requirements and having objective evidence for meeting those requirements may not be delegated, even though the actual work is delegated. In other words, I like to say that regardless of who's doing what, you can farm out whatever you want, but regardless of who's doing what, the manufacturer of record, in other words, the company whose name is at the top of the label, they are the ones that are ultimately responsible. Not just ultimately responsible in a regulatory or quality perspective, but also ultimately responsible from a product liability perspective, because those are the ones that the product liability attorneys are going to go after first. And finally, and this is perhaps the most important part, the essential elements that a quality system shall embody, without prescribing specific ways to establish these elements. Because the quality system regulation covers such a broad spectrum of devices, production processes, and so on, it allows some leeway. I would argue it allows a lot of leeway in the details of those quality system elements. It's left to the manufacturer to determine the necessity for or the extent of some of the quality elements, I would argue all of the quality elements, and to develop and implement specific procedures tailored to their particular processes and their particular devices. Now, this is right off of the FDA's website. So with the exception of a little bit of comments, that I added in there for color, no editorializing. This is right out of the FDA. But let's take this a step further. This logic should be applied to all regulation, in my opinion, no exceptions. I get frustrated sometimes when I hear some of my regulatory colleagues, requesting, more and more regulation from FDA and more specific regulation from FDA. I always like to say, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. So going on, one of my favorite things to talk about with people is to not just follow the rules, think. Douglas MacArthur said rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not advocating not following the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But what I am saying is this. It's very simple. If the rules make sense, then we should follow them. But if the rules don't make sense and we follow them anyway, and if we agree they don't make sense and yet we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? Again, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question for now. But in my opinion, we have too many, as John and I have talked about in some of our podcasts, too many box tickers, too many people that are just following regulation like a recipe, step 1, step 2, step 3, like a computer executing lines of code one after another without stopping and asking, does this make sense? And speaking of regulation, what's the true essence of regulation? Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I like to say regulation is all about the interpretation of words and your ability to defend your interpretation. You can read a set of words and interpret it one way. I can read it in the same set of words and interpret it a different way. Your company can read a set of words of regulation one way. FDA can read the same regulation and interpret it a different way. And it amazes me how many people seem to assume that FDA's interpretation is the only way, or indeed the best way, to interpret the words. Suffice it to say, not always. When I agree with FDA's interpretation, then great. But when I disagree with their interpretation, it's incumbent on me to go to the FDA and convince them why my interpretation is appropriate for my particular situation and theirs is not. And another thing, before we get back to the topic of merging change and risk, that I wanted you to think about is don't focus just on what the words say in a literal sense. Try to understand what the spirit of the regulation says. Not just the spirit of the law, but the letter of the law. This is a title from an interesting book. We allow words to obscure the interpretation of the deeper meaning. I think you can substitute the word regulation there as well. We allow regulation to obscure the interpretation of the deeper meaning. Try to understand the intent of that regulation. Why is it there? What is it trying to accomplish in order to use it to your best advantage? So coming back to a little bit more on change, and then we're going to integrate this with risk. I talked a bit about change, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. But what are the consequences of incremental change? One of the many interesting and important differences between medical device development and drug development is on the drug side of the world. Most drug companies, once they bring a drug onto the market, they don't want to change anything about it, because that conjures up all kinds of issues when it comes to the FDA. But on the medical device side of the universe, it's almost the opposite. We're changing medical devices all the time. As I said earlier, sometimes we notify the FDA of these changes, but more often than not, we don't. We handle them internally in the form of a letter to file. So what are the consequences of these incremental changes? Well, one consequence, which I've talked about in other venues, is something called change creep. Very similar to predicate creep, which is, in my opinion, is the Achilles heel of the 510K, something that we do really have to fix as an industry, although, for the record, I am not a fan of the 10-year predicate rule. I think that has disaster written all over it in every language. But we do need to come up with the predicate creep problem and a solution to that problem, and we do similarly need to come up with the change creep solution to that problem. But what I want to talk about here is, what about risk creep? This is something that we don't hear many people, at least I haven't heard people talking about it in our medical device industry. It is a phrase that's used in some other industries, but I haven't seen it. Perhaps in the discussion, John, you can correct me if You've seen this phrase, risk creep. But with all of the changes that we make to our medical devices and their associated changes in risk, do we risk, pardon the pun, experiencing risk creep? In other words, we make a small change to our device. That's not a big enough change to necessitate telling the FDA, but that change does cause a small change in risk. And again, we handle it as a letter to file. We don't share it with the FDA, which we're not required to do. And we make another change to our device. Once again, it's a quote unquote small change. We don't notify the FDA, but it might also make a small change in risk. And then we make a third change and a subsequent change in risk and so on. Exactly like in predicate creep, exactly like in change creep, and now in risk creep. What is the additive effect, if you will, if we take all of those small changes in risk, when we consider them one by one individually? Maybe they're not significant enough to worry about. But at a certain point over time, where these devices are changing, evolving over years, sometimes decades, at a certain point when we add those changes in risk together, at a certain point, they're going to become significant. That's the concept of risk creep. And one of the recommendations that I've made to companies when it comes to change creep is put a reminder in your QMS somewhere. Don't just consider changes individually, but periodically, maybe after a certain number of changes, after every 3 changes or every 5 or every whatever the number is, I don't care. Consider the additive effect. In other words, take into account that change creep. Do exactly the same thing with risk. Consider not just the changes in risk incrementally, but the additive effect over time. I don't like to quibble about the numbers, whether you do this on according to the calendar, like every 3 months or 6 months, whether you do it according to the number of changes, every three changes or every 5 changes, whatever. Quite frankly, I could care less, and that's up to you to decide based on your technology, how well established it is, and so on. But periodically, I do think we need to do that. Is it required? Well, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. So let's go further. How do we integrate change management and risk management? My simple recommendation, and this is my Mike Drew's recommendation, not just as a regulatory consultant, but more importantly, as a professional biomedical engineer. It's very simple. Any and all changes, I don't care what they are, and again, we'll look at some examples in a moment, but any and all changes should automatically necessitate a risk reevaluation. Any and all changes should automatically necessitate a risk reevaluation. The only question is, to what degree? In my opinion, it doesn't make sense to treat all changes and to do all risk evaluations the same. It makes this is not one of those everybody is treated equal, everybody that shows up gets a trophy. I'm sorry, this to me makes no sense. Instead, coming from a medical background, as some of you know, I used to teach medical school back in the day. Think triage. When you go to the emergency room, a patient that's having a heart attack should, at least theoretically speaking, be seen before a patient who has a splinter in their finger, right? That's the concept of triage. The exact same concept should be applied to changes and risk reevaluation, depending on the nature of the change. That will dictate the degree, if you will, the comprehensiveness of the risk reevaluation. And again, it's not enough to simply say, well, I've made this change to my medical device. It isn't going to affect risk very much. Therefore, I don't have to investigate it very much. With all due respect, people that think that way should not be working in this business, because that is not a responsible attitude to have as a medical device manufacturer. We have to investigate. The level of investigation, as I said, is going to be different depending on the change, but we have to have some level of investigation in order to determine which changes will necessitate more of a risk reevaluation and which changes might not. But at the end of the day, all changes should automatically trigger some level of risk reevaluation. Do we really need regulation to tell us this? I think it's common sense, but common sense isn't as common as some of us might think, right? This is stuff that they used to teach back in engineering school, but I'm not sure if they still teach that today. My additional recommendation here, and this is well beyond what's in the quote unquote regulation. Everybody focuses on risk, and that's the focus of today's webinar, the integration of change and risk. Well, risk is nothing more than a synonym of safety, right? So I like to say that risk and safety are sort of the opposite sides of the same coin. But where's the discussion of efficacy? If we change our medical device, yes, we have to do a risk reevaluation or a safety reevaluation, if you will. But what about the possibility of affecting its efficacy? What if we make a change to our medical device, and let's say, hypothetically speaking, it doesn't increase the risk, it doesn't change the risk, but it does increase the efficacy, and let's further say that it makes the efficacy lower than it was before. It's a very interesting kind of a perspective, and at least in my experience, and if any in the audience, wanna disagree in the discussion later, please feel free. But in my experience, most people don't consider the effect of a change on efficacy, and I think that's unfortunate. This is especially true not with 510Ks, because there's no efficacy requirement for a 510K, but for de novos and especially PMAs and HDEs, where efficacy is obviously very important. So one of the things that I hope as an audience will keep in mind here is when we make a change, yes, we should obviously evaluate the potential impact on the risk or the safety, but we should also think about what's the possible impact on efficacy. That's another thing that, as I said, not many people kind of think about. So if we're going to make a change, how do we assess that change, and how do we implement it? And finally, how do we validate that particular change? Well, one of the first places to start, believe it or not, is by asking the right questions. So the key to wisdom is asking the right questions. Questions are guaranteed in life, answers are not. Or put another way, to find the right answer, we must first ask the right question. To find the right answer, we must first ask the right question. As I often also like to say, answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. Answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. So in other words, what good is getting the right answer if we're asking the wrong question? So when it comes to change management and risk management and the integration of the two, we have to begin by asking the right questions, because if we don't ask the right questions, then our answers really don't matter, right? If we don't ask the right questions. So some of the questions, the obvious ones to start with, is what's the change? What's the nature of the change? Is it a design change, material change, and so on? Why are we making the change? I'll talk more about that in a moment as well. Does the change impact the risk in some way? And most importantly, how do we know? Please don't just tell me off the top of your head. We need to be able to support that. When FDA's doing their job, and let's be honest, they don't always do their job, but when they do their job, FDA's job more than anything else is to question everything. So I don't know where you are geographically at the moment, but I happen to be in San Diego. I'm looking out my window. The sun is shining. It's a blue sky. If I went into the FDA and said the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. That's the way this game is supposed to be played. And I play that with my customers as well. You tell me you've made a certain change to your device. You tell me that it doesn't make a change in the risk to that device. I say, okay, fine, prove it. And don't prove it to me in regulatory or quality terms. Prove it to me in engineering and biological terms, because at the end of the day, the engineering and the biology is infinitely more important than the regulation. With all due respect to my many regulatory friends who begin with the regulation first, I think that's a mistake. I think we have to begin with the biology and the engineering first, and then we let the regulation follow. So as a metaphor to help understand this better, consider the 510K risk requirements. And for those of you that are not familiar, I've reiterated them. I'm paraphrasing in my own Mike Drew's words here. There are two risk requirements when it comes to the 510K. First of all, for a successful 510K on the risk side, we have to show that our subject device, our new device, cannot pose any new risks that are not already in the predicate. That's risk requirement number one. And risk requirement number two, of the known risks, we have to show the FDA that our subject or our new device doesn't pose an increase in the level of known risks compared to the predicate device. In other words, we have to show that the known risks in our subject device are equal to or less than a similar risk in the predicate device. Theoretically speaking, if FDA can identify any new risk in our device compared to the predicate, or if they can identify any risk in our device that is higher than what is in the predicate, then that one piece of information in and of itself is enough to trump everything else and to make your device not applicable to a 510K. Now, this is a topic of a different discussion, but I can tell you that in the past, these risk requirements, which by the way have not changed since the 510K was created in 1976. FDA for decades has never taken such a literal interpretation of the risk requirements as they are taking today, for reasons that I won't get into here. If you're interested, you can watch my 510K and substantial equivalence webinar, which is also available through Greenlight Guru, which goes into this in much more detail. I'm simply, for the context of today's discussion, offering it as a metaphor by asking the right questions and trying to understand the relationship between change and risk. Simply apply the two 510K risk requirements. Does the change create new risks in your device compared to the previous version of your device? That's requirement number one. And requirement number two, does the change increase the level of any of the risks in your new version of the device compared to the previous version of the device? You know, when you think about it, we don't need more regulation. As a matter of fact, I would argue that we already have way too much regulation. And as a regulatory consultant, you might think that's a bit, odd that a regulatory consultant would say that we need to have too much regulation. I think we have plenty of regulation. I think what we don't have is enough people really understanding the regulation. Remember, I'm not talking about the letter of the law here. I'm talking about the spirit of the law. We need more people understanding the regulation that we already do have. And we have, here's a perfect example of that. We have the 510K risk regulation that we can apply to the intersection of change management and risk management. Continuing on to the next question, which changes necessitate a risk reevaluation and which do not? Well, another way that I can ask that same question is, are there any changes that you can think of that do not warrant a risk reevaluation? You know, there are very, very few things in the world that are black and white other than death and taxes. But perhaps in the regulatory world, here's one. I can't think, and again, if somebody can think of an example, please share it with us during our upcoming discussion in a few minutes. But I, as a biomedical engineer and as a regulatory consultant, somebody who's been playing this game for now about 30 years, I can't think of any change that would not warrant some form of risk reevaluation. Again, as I said earlier, it doesn't make sense to treat all of these reevaluations the same. We have to triage them. But every change that we make, and again, I'm going to share with you some examples in a moment, every change that we make should trigger some level of risk reevaluation. So my recommendation, and this is, again, a Mike Drew's recommendation, you can follow it or not, it's totally up to you. All changes necessitate some form of risk reevaluation. The only question is to what degree. And as I said, my further recommendation is don't treat all changes as though they're same. That to me makes absolutely no sense. As a matter of fact, if we did, it would bring product development to a grinding halt, right? I find it unfortunate as a former R&D engineer, a lot of R&D engineers, they just view regulation as something for, holding them back in terms of product development, and the intent of the philosophy of the regulation should not be to do that. And part of the reason why so many people think, especially R&D engineers, and again, I worked, for a long time as an R&D engineer, so many people think the reason that regulation holds them back is because regulation is applied universally or unilaterally across the board. And at least in my view, that's not the way this game is supposed to be played. Now, on the flip side, does this more tailorized approach, if you will, does it lead to a more complicated processes for your company, maybe more complicated QMS? Short answer, yep, absolutely. Sorry to put it that way, but that's the reality. But the question is, would you want it any other way? Changes that have a greater impact on the potential safety and efficacy of a product, especially a Class 3 device like a PMA, should, it stands to reason, necessitate a much closer, a much more detailed risk reevaluation than changing the color of the housing of the outside of some medical device, for example. I mean, to me, that's common sense. But in some cases, regrettably, in many cases, I see in the company's quality management system, and John, I would love to talk about this more in the discussion later. I see in the QMS that any change is investigated in the same way. And in my opinion, it's just ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense. So let's take a look at some examples of changes. And again, trying to keep in mind the change management versus the risk management. And just for planning purposes, I'm hoping to wrap up our discussion in about 10 minutes or so. We did start 10 minutes late, and then we'll reserve the last 15, 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to type them in as we go, so John and I can triage them, which of those questions we'll have time to discuss. So let's take a look at some examples. I mean, we can change a medical device in a litany of different ways. For example, we can make a cosmetic change. What if we change the color of the device? Or what if we change the font size of a display? What are the potential implications on risk? Well, those kinds of things usually need to be investigated probably by some sort of usability study. Doesn't have to be, a real big, formal, robust study, but just to make sure that if you change the color, if you change the font, what have you, it's not going to impact safety for performance, blah, 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 and especially it's not going to impact risk. We need to be able to demonstrate that some way. Whether we report that to the FDA ultimately or not, I could care less. And I don't mean to be overly flippant here. I really don't. I'm trying to emphasize certain things for an important reason, and that is whether something is required or not doesn't mean, or sorry, let me say it this way. Just because something may not be required doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't do it. Another thing that I've said in many of the conversations that John and I have had in our podcast is when a company gets a 510K or a de novo or a PMA, when they get a CE mark, when they get ISO certified, that's the academic equivalent of being a C student. That just means that you're passing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're making a safe and effective product. Certainly doesn't mean that you're making a good product, right? So we shouldn't be striving here simply for regulatory compliance or quality compliance. That's just, the academic equivalent of being a C student. We should be doing better than that. What about if we make a design change? As a biomedical engineer, obviously the phrase design change is a very, very broad phrase, right? So at one end of the spectrum, we might have a change in the shape or the size of the device, like we have a balloon angioplasty catheter that we make a little longer or a little fatter or narrower or something like that. That would be one kind of a design change, but another kind of a design change might be where we change the actual mechanism of action, or MOA, of the device. So again, to use that angioplasty catheter as a metaphor, one design change would be to take the balloon and make it bigger. A second design change would be an MOA, a mechanism of action change. In other words, take the balloon off the catheter, turn it into an atherectomy device. In other words, put essentially a Dremel on the end of your device to deal with the atherosclerosis. At the end of the day, the indication is still exactly the same, but the mechanism of action between a balloon angioplasty catheter and an atherectomy catheter is drastically different. So we have to be careful about overgeneralizing here. Design changes can range a very, very broad spectrum, and when we make that change, obviously we have to investigate the risks associated with them. And I would say perhaps there's some exceptions, but I think as a general rule, the degree of risk reevaluation that we will have to do is going to be a function of, among other things, whether or not there's a change in the mechanism of action. In other words, if you don't change the MOA, if you're just making a dimensional change, a size change, for example, then yeah, obviously there could be some impact, and there probably is some impact on risk, but that impact on risk is not going to be nearly as great as if we change the mechanism of action, as I said, going from angioplasty to atherectomy. Another type of change we could have is a material change. What if, for example, we have a device on the market that's made out of one material and we want to change it for another material, or we change it to a combination of different materials? What are the potential risk implications on those changes, and how do we investigate them? I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in the area of biomaterials. And coupling the two together, biomaterials and risk, I find a lot of times companies come into the FDA, they have made or they're proposing to make a change in their material without doing a detailed enough analysis on the potential impact of risk. So you need to consider both of those things together. This is another reason why I mentioned the metaphor copy and paste link earlier. When you change something, you need to automatically consider the risk reevaluation as well. Of course, you can have a change in the labeling of the device. And here I'm primarily talking about the high-level labeling, the indications for use or the intended use. In other words, we're modifying or changing an existing label claim versus we're adding a new label claim. Either one of them, but especially the latter, could be thought of as a label expansion. But again, there's lots of different types of label expansion. So what is the potential impact on risk of changing the labeling here? And don't even get me started on off-label use and the potential changes associated with a change in the off-label labeling of your device. And some of you are probably thinking, well, what does off-label labeling mean? Well, that's a topic of a different discussion. You might want to check out some of the information I put out there on labeling and off-label use for a better understanding of that. And finally, a change in the manufacturing process. Now, in the 510K and de novo worlds, there is not, at least not yet, a requirement to put in the 510K or de novo submission any information about the manufacturing process, but there is in the PMA world. If you have a PMA, FDA wants to see some information. It's not real specific as to the degree, that's up to us, but some information about the manufacturing process. It's not, at least not yet, in the 510K regulation. We have had discussions at FDA about putting it in there, and I think overall it is a good idea to put it in there because, let's be honest, even in the sub-class 3 universe, even in the class 2 and below universe, in 510Ks and de novos, our technologies are becoming more complicated. Our manufacturing processes are becoming more complicated. And by the way, it doesn't make sense to me, this is sort of a criticism of the design controls, to separate the design of our device from the manufacturing process we use to make it. To me, those two things are intimately related to one another. So as our 510K devices are becoming more technologically complex, and as our manufacturing methods to make them are becoming more technologically complex, I think there are some potential advantages of asking FDA to be a part of that evaluation process for the 510K or the de novo submission, but it's not on the books yet. So, but it might be. And finally, the types of changes that we can make to medical devices is endless. I've just given you, 5 examples here, but unlike drugs, and this is a very, very different way of thinking, medical device change happens all the time. It's very evolutionary as opposed to drugs where it's not. And the reason why I make a point of this is because I do a lot of work in the area of combination products. And I see companies who try to apply their drug change management policy, procedures to a device in a combination product, which basically brings the whole thing to a stagnating halt. Because, as I said earlier, drug companies don't usually like to make changes to their product. And on the flip side, I see medical device companies who are getting into combination products like drug-eluting stents, for example. They try to apply their change management processes and procedures to the drug side. And again, that has disaster written all over it. They're very different from one another, and we have to consider them differently. Almost to the end here, just 1 or 2 last questions to talk about. How does change management and risk management vary pre-market versus post-market? Well, when it comes to pre-market, some people are probably scratching their head and probably thinking like, well, gee, what the heck does change management mean during product development? Because after all, we don't have a product on the market yet. Therefore, how can we talk about changing it? Well, in a strict regulatory sense, I can understand that argument. However, here's where it breaks down. As a former R&D engineer, I would make a prototype of a device. I would then test it and then make a change. And then I would make another prototype and test it and make a change and so on and so on. So we do have change management in the pre-market world as well, or at least changes to devices in the pre-market world as well. But we don't usually handle them in the same way. I think in principle and philosophy, they're exactly the same. All of this information should be captured in your various quality documentation, but we don't handle it in a formal way. And from the FDA's perspective, it's really not FDA's business. Yes, they ask about it from time to time, but when you think about it, it's really none of FDA's business about the changes that we've made prior to our actual final design freeze device that we're going to bring onto the market. In other words, what difference does it make to the FDA if I have 10 different catheters that have, a slightly different durometer of material or a slightly different length or diameter or something like that? What is ultimately important to the FDA is the final device, the device that I'm actually bringing to the market that I'm going to sell and so on. On the post-market side, of course, this is when most people think of change management in a much more formal way. And again, it comes back to asking the right questions. The first question, and one of the first questions to ask, of course, is where are these changes coming from? Are they coming from the users, the physicians or surgeons, or perhaps patients that are using our device? What about changes that we consider that result from either post-market surveillance or real-world evidence? I think companies that are not using either PMS or RWE or a combination of both to come up with and propose changes really are not doing their job. What about changes that come up, that are suggested by us? An R&D engineer, for example, comes up with a way to tweak our device that might make it better. What's going to be that impact on risk? And what about coming from our competitors? For example, if we have our 510K device that's substantially equivalent to a predicate from a different company, and the other company experiences a problem with their predicate, do we have, as a manufacturer, an obligation, never mind just in a regulatory or legal sense, but do we have an obligation in a professional or an ethical sense to at least investigate or ask the question, is the problem that the other manufacturer is having, could that problem happen to us? And could it have an impact on the risk of our particular products? I can tell you that, as some in the audience know, I work as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases. I've been involved in several 510K product liability cases where a company has gotten sued. And one of the things that we're able to demonstrate is that the company knew or should have known about these potential problems because their competitor, which, oh, by the way, that company brought their product onto the market, making a substantial equivalence argument to their device. Their competitor experienced exactly the same problem. So just because a company might not be required to do that, and now finally, after many, many years, that regulation is starting to change. But again, to me, this is a statement of the obvious. This is common sense. This is what we should be doing as manufacturers all the time. But of course, I did not fall off the turnip truck yesterday. There are, regrettably, some companies out there and people in them that won't do something unless they're absolutely required to do it. So by looking at what our competitors are experiencing, that's a good way to look at for these kinds of potential problems. And then finally, what if the device itself is capable of making a change? And this is when we get into the very interesting area of artificial intelligence. And this is the last question that I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A and some discussion. What if the device itself is capable of changing, or as I like to say, evolving, without any help from you as the manufacturer or from the outside world? This is the essence of what I call true artificial intelligence. Now, this is a topic totally in and of itself, and we could easily do a webinar, probably multiple webinars on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But just a couple of questions that I'd throw out there to for the audience to kind of ruminate over. First of all, is artificial intelligence and machine learning a drastically overused phrase? In my opinion, absolutely yes. There are a lot of companies, sometimes companies come to me and they say, hey, Mike, we're using AI as part of our medical device. And when they tell me, about their technology, there's nothing in there that's even remotely intelligent about it. And at the moment, FDA has approved about 30 medical devices now. There are 30 medical devices that have gone through the FDA that are on the market that have, or at least supposedly have, some aspect of artificial intelligence. Well, when I look at those devices as a biomedical engineer, in most, if not all of them, and I've looked at many and I've been involved in several medical devices now, SAMD, software as medical device, but even hardware that involves AI as well. When I look at most, if not all of these devices, there's no AI in it. So in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, it's a drastically overused space. And to be fair, it's not like there was never AI in it. It's that they had AI in it before, but then in order to get it onto the market, they disabled the AI. They dumbed down the technology. I'll talk about that in a moment. So what is true AI? True AI to me, truly artificial intelligence to me, is nothing more than a spin on Darwinian evolution. It's exactly Darwinian evolution. In other words, true artificial intelligence is a product, whether it's a software as a medical device alone or software plus some other stuff. It's a product that is capable of learning and changing and evolving all by itself without any help from the outside world. In other words, I'm going to use a simple example, a catheter. If we put a catheter onto the market today, and we find out, for example, from our cardiologist users that they want that catheter to be a little longer or a little shorter, obviously that catheter is not capable of changing its length by itself. Although, yes, from an engineering perspective, we could use piezoelectric and other kinds of materials to change the material and the mechanical properties of the device, but let's assume that we're not going quite that far. The catheter is not capable of changing the length by itself. An artificially intelligent catheter, if you will, would be one that could identify the potential problem, that the catheter is not long enough to get where it needs to go, for example. It would then evolve by growing in length all by itself. The manufacturer would not have to do it in order to solve that problem. So true artificial intelligence, and by this definition, there's very, very few products out there that are truly artificially intelligent. True artificial intelligence is the ability to learn, change, and evolve over time without any input from the outside world. So is this really any different as different as so many people think? Again, obviously this webinar is about change management and risk management. Well, when you understand not what the regulation says, but the principle of the regulation, the philosophy, then the principle, the philosophy is exactly the same. Exactly the same. The only difference is that the change management and consequently the risk management, the only difference is who controls the change. With a conventional catheter, the manufacturer controls the change because a catheter can't change by itself. Whereas with true AI, the manufacturer doesn't control the change. The software does. And this is where the regulatory challenge comes in. Because in order to fit these new artificial intelligent technologies into our old regulatory paradigm, we've essentially had to dumb down our technology. In other words, this is what, as some of you know, FDA has introduced this concept of a locked algorithm. In my opinion, a total oxymoron. I mean, you're sucking the artificial intelligence right out of the product. And as a result, it's really holding us back. But in FDA's defense, and I have a number of solutions that we're working with FDA now to come around with this and get around this concept of a locked algorithm. But in FDA's defense, the reason why they created this concept is to control the change management. Because how do we validate a change, for example, that the software is doing itself when we and the manufacturer might not even know that the software is changing, right? So there is a reason in the short term to have this concept of a locked algorithm. But in the long term, I think it's really holding us back. For those that are interested, I've done a couple of podcasts with Greenlight and John on this topic. One a couple of years ago that you see on the left, and I'm very proud to say that I'm told is one of the most popular podcasts, might even be the most popular podcast in that series. And then a very recent sort of an update of this podcast just a couple of weeks ago, just earlier this month. So for those that are interested, and for those of you that work in AI, I highly encourage you to listen. And even for those of you that don't work in AI, I highly encourage you to listen, because another philosophy that's important that I try to instill in people is it's important to look for similarities where no similarities seem to exist. It's important to look for similarities where no similarities seem to exist. So even though you might not be working in an area like artificial intelligence, say you're working on, I don't know, a heart valve or an in vitro diagnostic or something else, there could be similarities, for example, in regulatory logic or regulatory strategy that we use in artificial intelligence that you can apply in heart valves or IVDs or something like that. So always look for similarities where no similarities seem to exist. And finally, and this is the last question, what are the consequences of not integrating change management and risk management? Well, usually they're not good. Usually, you run the risk of missing something, and you probably will miss something. So if you don't connect the dots, you run the risk of missing something. And as I talked about before, that could generate not just regulatory concerns and quality concerns, but product liability concerns as well. So to wrap this up in terms of some final recommendations, any and all changes, this is a no-brainer for me, any and all changes should automatically necessitate a risk reevaluation. Whether it explicitly says that in the regulation somewhere or not really doesn't matter to me. Any and all changes should automatically necessitate a risk reevaluation. The only question, the only gray area, the only ambiguity, is to what degree. And as I talked about before, think triage. Not all changes should be treated the same. Cosmetic changes are obviously lesser of a concern than a change to the mechanism of action, for example. Consider the ramifications of these changes before you implement them, during the implementation, and especially, but not least, after the implementation. Because if you have a potential risk that you think is going to be a deal breaker, you might not want to make that change. Therefore, why go through all of the time and effort and expense of doing the additional testing if from a risk perspective it causes you to hesitate because you don't think it's worth pursuing. On the other hand, when you get to the final implementation, this is, to me, this is the most basic tenets of the design controls. You want to do your final V&V testing, your final verification and validation testing on your design freeze device. Now, that's what the theory says. That's what the regulatory textbook says. That doesn't always happen in reality, but that's what the theory says. But when you make a change, now you have to do at least some, maybe all, of that V&V testing over again. That's part of your risk reevaluation, proving it. Remember, not making a change also can change a risk, because if there is post-market surveillance data out there, if there is real-world evidence out there, if there are complaints, if there are information from your competitors, if you're not routinely looking at that information, and as a result, you don't change your medical device to, for example, mitigate that risk that's known today that might not have been known a year ago or 5 years ago, the risk of your product is actually now increased because you have not implemented that change. So it's a very interesting perspective, very, very interesting view of the world. Not changing your device in scenarios as I described today can actually change, and in some cases increase. Usually it doesn't decrease, but usually increase your risk. Bottom line, do we need regulation to tell us all of these things? Isn't it common sense? Should it be common sense? I mean, what can I say? Here's an interesting little sign that says, if you have no common sense, please ask for assistance. So if you're not, if you don't have subject matter expertise in some of the areas that I've talked about today, and none of us can be experts in everything, my wife constantly reminds me of what I don't know, seek out people who can help, whether they're other people in your organization, whether they're external consultants like Greenlight Guru or myself, but seek out other people that can help, because not having all of the information, that's okay, but not getting the tools and the players in place to get into that information, that's not okay. So to wrap this up, we've talked about a lot in terms of integrating risk and change management, connecting those knots, implementing those changes, trying to decide when those changes necessitate an evaluation, and when they don't, bottom line, it always does. How does change management and risk management differ pre versus post market? And then if your device is capable of changing or evolving by itself, how do we handle that? And the consequences of not doing these things for those companies out there that don't. So just to wrap this up, just to share a final thought with you from Albert Einstein, very smart guy. This is one of my favorite quotes from Einstein, who I don't hear a lot of people attribute very often. Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. I love that. Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. Or put a slightly different way, from Steve Jobs, who said, it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. Rather, we should hire smart people so that they can tell us what to do. And by that definition, my wife is much smarter than I am, because she's constantly telling me what to do. Anyway, the last thing I'll mention is there are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but there are not that many good ones. So how do you become a good one if that's your desire, or how do you find a good one if you need to find somebody? Very simple. Learn when to lead, but more importantly, learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. If it's to my advantage to follow the regulation when it comes to connecting the dots between change management and risk management the way other people have done it, then so be it. No problem. I'll go into the FTA and in my PowerPoint in 72-point font, I'll say I'm doing nothing more than what the people did before me. End of discussion. Don't let the door hit you in the you-know-what on the way out. But on the other hand, if it's not to my advantage, or if it's not possible to follow that regulation, then I need to use my own intelligence, my own, artificial or not, my own intelligence, my own creativity, my own knowledge of biology and engineering to make the regulation work. Because a person, and I probably should, in this politically correct era that we live in today, I should change that. A person who wants to lead the orchestra must first turn their back on the crowd. A person who wants to lead the orchestra must first turn their back on the crowd. And unfortunately, at least in my experience, after playing this game now for about 30 years, I don't see enough people doing that. So at this point, I want to wrap this up. We have a few minutes left over. I know we started about 10 minutes late. If anybody has any questions or comments, if you want to agree with anything that I said, if you want to disagree with anything that I said, I love it when people disagree. Just make sure that you can articulate as to why. But for those of you that do have to leave right now, I want to thank everybody for listening. And if there's anything I can do to help in the future, by all means, feel free to contact me. You have my phone and my email and so on. But for those that can stick around and have a little Q&A, John, I'm sure we've probably got some interesting questions to discuss. I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, for sure. And again, thank you to everyone for being patient as we work through some technical kinks earlier on the webinar. We do have a few questions. Mike, I know we're just a couple minutes from the scheduled time. In the event that we go a little bit past half past hour, are you able to stick around, maybe answer a couple questions? We'll go a little bit
I'd
longer.
be happy to, John.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
I guess one of the benefits of being a moderator is you get the opportunity to ask a question. And I wanted to ask you a question, maybe a little bit more on the philosophical side of things, about in the event that I think that point a couple slides ago is really poignant about no change doesn't mean the risk doesn't change. I think I said that correctly. And let's imagine I'm in the scenario where I'm getting feedback from the use of my product, and maybe I learned something about an adverse event and what have you, and that might drive me to go update the risk management or the risk assessment for that particular product because of new intel and information that I gathered. Let's imagine that the risk increases from that new intel. Should that drive me to make a change to my product in some sort of way? I know this is a philosophical question, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a great question, John. And yeah, on one hand, it's a philosophical question, but I would also argue that it's a very, very pragmatic question, John. And here's the way I would kind of phrase the question that you're asking, but in a slightly different way. You probably know as much, maybe more than anybody else, on quality management systems and what goes into a good quality management system. And you can certainly tell us, I'm sure, in nauseating detail about the requirements of when you make a change, having the corresponding risk reevaluation that I talked about. But tell me, John, where in most companies' quality management systems does it say if we've made no changes over a certain period of time, then we still should do a risk reevaluation? Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I don't think I've ever seen it in there. And your point that amplifies one of the points that I tried to make towards the tail end of the webinar is if we're not using that information, maybe it didn't come from us directly, internally, our own, R&D folks or marketing folks or our own testing. Maybe it's out there, from competitive products or real world evidence, whatever. Isn't that just as problematic, potentially even more problematic than making a change and not properly evaluating it?
Yeah,
what do you think, John?
I think this is an area where we as an industry are still struggling. I mean, you and I have talked one-on-one in webinars and podcasts in the past about change management and how we as an industry we have opportunities for improvement. I think risk, especially post-market and total product lifecycle risk, I think is another area. But to your point, yeah, very few companies that I'm aware of, or in fact, I can't think of any that require or implements a proactive practice about of being assessing and evaluating risk and revisiting that from time to time. I think this is sort of the essence or sort of the emphasis that we're seeing with the new European medical device regulations about putting a lot more emphasis. But kind of gets back to your earlier point, is we shouldn't wait for regulations to be implemented to drive best practices. But
and I would just add one quick comment to that, John, please, and then we can move on to the next question. Look, given a choice, I would much prefer to focus on the carrot rather than the stick. So let's,
for sure,
if the carrot being the regulatory and the quality reasons for investigating these changes or the lack thereof is not enough, let's talk about the stick, right? If I, as an expert witness in a medical device product liability case, can show that the manufacturer was aware of or should have been aware of certain risks that occurred in other similar products, but didn't investigate them, didn't implement the changes necessary to mitigate the risks in their own medical device. And as a result, a person was harmed or perhaps even worse. John, I hope it doesn't take a JD from Harvard Law to appreciate ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. So so this idea of no changes can actually change the risk, I think, is a very interesting one, certainly from a regulatory and quality perspective, but also from a product liability perspective as well. Something to think about. Uh-oh, John, are you still there? I don't know. Did we lose you? Maybe you lost your internet again.
Hi, Mike. This is Tori. I'm stepping in, and John did lose his audio. So,
thank you, Tori, for stepping in.
Yeah, no problem. And I work alongside John and Nick on the marketing side for all of those who are listening. So, Mike, great presentation. Let's go through these questions, see which of these you can answer. All right. So, someone asked, could you please give us an example of how the investigation would look for a small change to the design, color, shape, any type of aesthetic change? So what type of investigation would you recommend in this case?
So it's a great question, and thank you to that person in the audience for asking. Thank you again, Tori, for stepping in for John. I guess he broke the internet again. Anyway, it's a great question, but even though it's a fairly focused question, we're talking about a cosmetic change like a color change, it's still very, very difficult to answer in sort of a general or ubiquitous sense. In other words, if the color change, let's say we have some sort of a box, like again, think of a piece of telemetry, like a EKG monitor, and we decide for whatever reasons to change the color of the outside housing of that box from one particular shade of blue to another particular shade of blue. At the end of the day, quite frankly, who cares, right? I could care less. But on the other hand, let's use that same EKG as an example. If I decide for whatever reason to change the color of the, I don't know what they call it, but the bouncing waveform that's displayed on the screen, and it turns out that that waveform then gets closer in color to the background, and it might be difficult for somebody with, you know, relatively normal vision to be able to distinguish the two. Now we start to, you know, we start to introduce some potential risks. And if a cardiologist misses a subtle aspect of an EKG waveform because of that color change, and as a result doesn't, for example, make a certain diagnosis or doesn't change the dosage of a drug or something like that, I think, Tori, and whoever asked that question in the audience, I think now that seemingly simple color change could have potential drastic ramifications. So this is what I said earlier in the webinar, Tori, when I talked about asking the right questions. It's not enough to simply say we're making a color change. We have to have some further understanding as to the context of that color change and the potential ramifications. Does that make sense, Tori?
Yes, yes, of course. Yeah, thank you. All right. Now this question is from Andreas, and it is a unique situation, but I find it really interesting. He asked, or she asked, what if a change needs to be done to a device after design freeze, but during a clinical trial? Does it make the trial obsolete? Does it need to be reapproved by FDA?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrea. Thank you for the question. So we have a device that's at design freeze. It's not on the market yet because we're still presumably in the clinical trial, but we make a change to it. Well, one of the first questions I would ask Tori and Andreas is, how do you define design freeze? Because if you're still making changes after you've gotten design freeze, then what the heck does the design freeze mean? That said, let's not talk about the semantics of what design freeze means. Here's the concern that I have. Does that change potentially impact the results of that clinical trial? So once again, if it's a cosmetic change, the outside housing of a box or something, then there's no, it's not a snowball's chance here in Southern California that change is going to impact the results of that clinical trial. On the other hand, if that change could impact the results of the clinical trial, now you run the risk of, when FDA looks at this, they say, you know what, you've made a change to your device. That change could impact safety, efficacy, performance, risk, yada, yada. That change could impact the results of the clinical trial, and therefore we want you to do that whole clinical trial over again. So again, it's a little difficult to answer in a very general or a ubiquitous sense, but the first thing that I would be asking is how, if at all, that change is going to influence the results. And then the step two is taking this to the FDA prophylactically. I would not do it in your submission. There's no better way to just put a red flag on the top of your submission and say, FDA, don't even waste your time reading this, just throw it right back in myself. I would take it to them probably in the form of a pre-submission meeting and make sure that they see that change as, if I say the word not significant, it's going to confuse people like a significant risk device, but it's not a significant change in the change management and risk management sense of the word. I hope that makes sense, Andrea. If you want to ask a follow-up, please feel free.
Thank you. And I think we have time for about one more question.
Okay.
So let's see. Brian asked, how do I know if my change management system is working? What kind of evidence do I need to show that the risk analysis was completed? Would it be meeting minutes, updated FMEA doc?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ryan. Thank you for asking that. And fundamentally, what you're asking is, how do we validate not just our change management system, but how do we validate our whole quality management system? As an engineer, I learned long ago not to assume that just because my system meets the regulatory requirements means that it's working, right? So how do we validate it? Well, there's a number of ways that we can validate it, Ryan, and specifically the change management portion of it. One is to create, let's just say, a fictitious change. In other words, introduce that fictitious change, not for the purposes of changing your device, but rather for the purposes of validating your system, and then run it through your process, your change management. Make sure that it, triggers a risk reevaluation. Make sure that that the appropriate testing and so on would be done. It's sort of an error detection method, if you will. And for those of you that are familiar with design controls, this should not be a foreign concept to you. This is, the concept of an independent reviewer. So here's a suggestion, Ryan, not to market my own services here, but here's one thing that you might consider. Bring somebody from the outside, like me, in, create a fictitious change, introduce it into your system, then have it go run through your process, and your R&D and your manufacturing, whoever people are, say, okay, here's the proposed change, this is the documentation that we're going to create, this is the testing that we're going to do, and so on. And then at the end of this process, have me evaluate whether I think your response to that fictitious change is appropriate. I think that's certainly not the only way to validate your system, Ryan, but I think that would be an interesting way to do it. It's interesting. All of you know we're required to show the safety and efficacy of our products, but don't you think it's a little ironic that we're not required to show the efficacy of our systems? Don't you think it's ironic that, we can just put a system in place on paper and just kind of assume that it works? Something to think about.